So last week, we finished up chapter 3 of the book of Ecclesiastes. And chapter 3 was all talking about the different cycles in life, a time for every purpose under heaven. And everything was somewhat in a circle. He says, I see it happening over and over again. There's a time for everything. And then he says in verse 16 of 3, he talks about he saw injustice in the world. In the place of rulers and judgment, there was wickedness and injustice. And so he talked about that. And then in chapter 4, he kind of picks back up that idea of injustice in the place that we should have righteousness and justice. And so in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 1, he says, Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. So the teacher comes back. To the, evidently we're having some kind of technical difficulties. The teacher comes back to the injustice. And he comes back and he says, I looked and considered all the oppression that's done under the sun. He says, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. He says, on the side of their oppressors, there's power. So those who are oppressing the people, they're the ones in power. So he's talking about how leadership can become corrupt and how that leadership can push down on people instead of helping people. True leadership, true godly leadership, I should say, is supposed to be there to help people accomplish the things they need to accomplish. They're there to create justice, to judge properly, and to do things. But as we've seen throughout the world, throughout history, corruption happens. There's a saying that I was taught in high school by my high school world history teacher, Miss Mulkey. She said, and I'm sure it's well known throughout everything, she didn't originate it, but it was, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is the nature of humans. When we have power, we tend to use it to push people down and make ourselves look bigger. And he says, I see it. He says, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors is power, but they have no power or no comfort. And you have to remember, the teacher is coming at the meaning of life from philosophy. He's not using, I wouldn't say he's really rejecting it, but he's not using the filter of God and the promises of God to look at the meaning of life. He's trying to kind of play the devil's advocate and say, this is how the world would try and find the meaning of life. That's what the book of Ecclesiastes is. And he says, you see it, and they have no comforter. But whenever you look at it from the side of God, who loves us and is a good father, it says in Isaiah chapter 51, verse 12 and 13, he says, I, even I, am he who comforts you. Who are you that you should be afraid of man who will die, and the Son of Man who will be made like grass? And you forget that the Lord your Maker, who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth, you have feared continually every day because of the fury of the oppressor when he is prepared to destroy. And where is the fury of the oppressor? In other words, God is saying, I'm there. I'm the one who comforts you. You have your eyes on the oppressor when you should have your eyes on me. I stretched out the heavens. I laid the foundation of the earth. And you're afraid of man who dies? And then, of course, The New Testament, we have 2 Corinthians 1:3. He says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God." We are comforted so that we can extend God's comfort to those around us. But the teacher is looking at it from the other side, from the world side, and he says there is no comfort for those that are oppressed. And so he comes to a conclusion in verse 3. He says, or in verse 2 and 3, he says, "Therefore I praise the dead who were already dead, more than the living who are still alive," because they still have to live and see the oppression. Whether or not they're the oppressed, they get to see it. And it's depressing whenever we see the injustice that happens in the world. It's very frustrating because we don't have the power to help in many times and many circumstances. He says, "Yet better than both is he who has never existed, he who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." This is very similar to what Job said whenever he was going through his trial. He says, "I wish that I had never been born. May the day that I was born cease to exist in history." He says, "I wish that no one ever came to my dad and said, 'Congratulations, a boy is born.' I wish I had died before I lived. I wish I had never been born." In fact, he even said, "I wish I had been a stillbirth, that my mother's womb would have been my tomb." But remember, Job also said in chapter 19, verse 25, he says, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, I know this, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. If you should say, 'How shall we persecute him?' Since the root of the matter is found in me, be afraid of the sword for yourself. For wrath brings punishment of the sword, that you may know that there is a judgment." See, Job is one of those few people in ancient times that realized that there was some kind of an afterlife. Not only an afterlife, but a physical afterlife, which is what Christ came proclaiming. That was unheard of in Job's day. That not only was there an afterlife other than living through your kids and your ancestors, but there was an afterlife where you are resurrected. And Job says, "I know this, that in my flesh, I will see God. I will behold him and not another." He had that depression and that feeling that, oh, I wish I had never been born, because of the torment that he went through. And it was bad. But yet he said, "I know my Redeemer lives. And in the end, I will see him." It doesn't matter what happens on this earth. You may be the most oppressed and tried person on the planet. As long as you hold on to that same idea, that same hope that Job had. He said, "I know that my Redeemer, not my failure, my Redeemer lives. And in the end, I will see him face to face." Then in verse 4, he says again, "I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is a vanity and a grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind." He says, "I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor." So we start looking at that, and we're human. We were designed to see other people. And our human nature is one that compares. Every time you see someone, it's natural to compare yourself to them. But it moves beyond that. It's the difference between competition and envy. Healthy competition is good. That's where we get all of our progress as a society. One person sees something and says, I can do that better. Let me show you how. And suddenly we have an advancement, whether it be in mechanics or sciences or whatever it is. And we see a better way to do things. And that leads us on and we have this better thing. However, too much competition bleeds into envy. And envy, of course, leads into covetousness, where we want what the other person has. Not we want to be able to do it, but we want their stuff. We are envious. They say, I wish I could do that, not necessarily so that they can do it better, but because they can show that they are better. He says there's an envy. Every good work that's done, a neighbor will look over and see his neighbor and say, you know what? I don't like that neighbor. Why? Because I want what he's got. I want what they have. They have something I want. And instead of spurring us on to do better and try and create that healthy competition, it creates a situation where we want to take from them and make ourselves greater and push them down at the same time. It's the corruption of leadership that we see. Power corrupts. And so we have that corruption here, where it's not I want to be in healthy competition and be friends with my neighbor so that we can both grow. He says, I want them to be underneath me. He says, this is a vanity. This is meaningless. It's like grasping for the wind. It makes no sense, because instead of leading society on and becoming greater, you put one person greater and they push down society. And so he says this is a vanity. It's meaningless. It's grasping for the wind. And in verse 5 he says, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. This is laziness. Some people, they look over, and whenever they see their neighbor doing great, instead of going, I want to be in healthy competition with them, or instead of becoming envious of them, they just go, you know what? I can't do that. I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to sit here and do nothing. I'm going to become lazy. The Proverbs talk about the lazy man who is so lazy he can't even bring his hand from the food dish to his mouth to feed himself, because he's so lazy. He just lays there starving to death with his hand in the food, but not eating. And we say, well, that's ridiculous. It is. It's pushing it out to the extreme, but it shows a point. Some people are so lazy that they won't help themselves, even whenever they see and they have all of the equipment and all of the skills and everything they need right at their fingertips. They still won't do it. These are the people that have become dependent on others to take care of them. But remember what Paul said to, I think it was the Corinthian church. He said, I taught you while I was there. If someone won't work, they shouldn't eat. In other words, we shouldn't be supporting those people who are too lazy to support themselves. Let them starve until they figure out that they need to feed themselves. A lot of Christians have a hard time remembering that particular teaching of Paul. We should work. We should do what we need to do. We shouldn't be lazy. We shouldn't just expect people to feed us and take care of us. We should stand up and do the things that God has given us the ability to do. And whenever we still have a need, that's when we reach out for help. But we do what we can with what we've got. And that's what God expects of us. He doesn't expect everyone to do the mighty, huge works. But he does expect you to do what he asks you to do with what you've got. And one of those things is supporting yourself and your family and taking care of the business you can take care of. But then we have verse 6 where he says, better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. So now we talked about laziness. Now we're talking about greed. Better to have just one hand full than both hands so full and you're trying to get more and everything just keeps falling out. This, I know a lot of people don't really, some people I know don't really like this saying, but it's that whole idea of the bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. The grass isn't always greener on the other side. It's that idea of being content with what you've got instead of wanting more. And he says, it's better to have one hand full with quietness than both hands full with toil and you keep dropping everything. You got to work to keep it. And so in verse 7, he says, then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, without companion. He has neither son or brother, yet there is no end to all his labor, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. He said, there's a guy that I saw. He lives alone. He doesn't have a family. He has no son, no brother. He's all alone. And yet he keeps pulling in more and more riches. He keeps working himself to death to get more and more money. But he never stops to ask, why am I doing this? Why do I want this money? This is beyond greed. This is having money and working for money for the sake of having money in the bank. I want millions of dollars. Why? So I can keep it. Okay, what's the point in that? He says, I saw a person, he doesn't have anyone to give this money to. He doesn't spend it on anything. He lives like a poor man and he has millions of dollars and he just keeps working for more and more and more and more and more and just working and working and working and he's toiling and there's no end to his labor. And notice this one, he not only called it vanity, which means it's meaningless, but he said, this is a grave misfortune. He said, this is a grave mistake because the guy's going to die sad because all he did was work all his life. And what's going to happen to the money? He doesn't have anyone to give it to. So it's going to go to a stranger who he's never known. He said, this is a grave misfortune. So we have the example of envy, of laziness, of greed, and extreme greed. And he says it's all meaningless. It has no meaning whatsoever. This is not the meaning of life. Gathering riches and having stuff is not what life is for. He says that envy and that greed, it creates that power where power corrupts and you become bad. He says it's all this whole misfortune of injustice going on and it's all meaningless. It has no meaning to it. And so he stops for a second after talking about the guy who is all alone. And he says in verse 9, he says, two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So he takes a minute to pause and he's like, if you're one of those people that don't like other people and you want to live alone, think about this. Two is better than one. Because one is the loneliest number. You're all alone. Sorry, I couldn't help that one. One, you're all alone. You work and you can accomplish so much, but you can only accomplish so much. Whenever someone else helps you and is working with you, you don't work double. Most of the time, it works exponentially. You do more together than two people can do individually by themselves. It works out to even greater. It's a multiplication effect instead of just an adding effect. And so he says two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. He says also, if one starts to stumble, the other can catch him and hold him up. And we see that as the physical walking next to each other. But look at it in the business world. Someone starts to become a little corrupt. The other one can draw him back into the right place, and they can continue to both be successful and help society out. And so there's that situation. And then he goes on, woe to the one who falls when he's alone. There's no one to help him. There's no one to correct his step, no one to help him back up. Then, of course, he goes into if you're in a cold place and you're all alone, you can't warm up. This is before the age of electric heaters. He says, how can one be warm by himself? He says, but if there's another person to conserve body heat, and even now, that's one of for those that are like up in very cold areas, like the Arctic and the Antarctic and all that kind of stuff, they know that if they have a companion and they're freezing, they need to conserve body heat. You've got to cuddle with that person, whether you like them or not. Because it's a survival thing at that point, two people, and it creates a warmth that's greater than just two people. It's still a survival technique to conserve the body heat. And so we have these situations, and then he says, though one may be overpowered, someone's attacking, he can be overcome. But if there's two, they can overcome the attacker. So working together gives you protection as well as security. And he says, and then he throws in the last part, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So you have the braided cord that's now 3 strands instead of just 2. It's a step further. 3 people working together accomplish a whole lot more than 3 people working individually, because they can use each other's skills in different way, and it grows. And so he says you have this companionship, and you can take this idea into every relationship you have in life. Whether it's work relationship, personal relationship, a Christian relationship of accountability, whatever it is, as you work together, a ministry relationship, you accomplish more. That's why the New Testament says, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together, as is the manner of some. We need to go to church. We need to come together. We need to talk about the things that are going on in our life so that our Christian brothers and sisters can give us advice and help us out. So that whenever we start to stumble, someone can help us back up. Whenever we feel like we're alone and cold, they can come and offer the warmth of Christ. And whenever we feel attacked by the world, we can have the strength of our Christian brothers and sisters. Then in verse 13, he says, better a poor and wise youth than an old foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king, yet those who come after will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is a vanity and a grasping for the wind. He goes back to leadership and corrupt leadership. He says, Better the poor, wise youth who's in prison than the old, foolish king who refuses any counsel anymore, who says, I've already had all the counsel I need. It's what I say goes. This is what's going to happen. And if you don't like it, too bad. And so the people rose up and they took out the king. And who they put in his place? The poor, wise youth from the prison. But as the poor, wise youth lived in a position of power, he starts to become corrupt himself, just like the other king. That's why he says there was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Everyone was serving this guy because he was wise. But whenever it came time, it says, those who come after will not rejoice in him. In other words, he became corrupt too. That's why he says, surely this is a vanity and a grasping after the wind. We have corrupt leadership, so we overthrow it and we put someone else in there, and guess what? They're corrupt too. I mean, I've always enjoyed reading about Russian history. I find it very interesting. But this is a perfect example of what happened in Russian history. They had the czars who were corrupt. They weren't good leaders most of the time. Some of them were, some of them weren't. And so the Bolshevik Revolution came in, wiped out the czars, and Lenin was in place, and he wasn't exactly pure. And then whenever he died, Stalin came in, who was one of the most ruthless, if not the ruthless leader that we've ever seen. Killed millions of his own people. They weren't sad when he died. And that's exactly what he's talking about. Because Stalin was born an extremely poor person, not even in Russia. He wasn't Russian. And so it shows this pattern perfectly. And the teacher is saying, this is what I see happen. And remember, he's already talked about the cycles in life, the seasons that just repeat over and over and over, and things that happen. And so he sees those seasons and he sees this happening, and he says, this is meaningless. And he's crying out, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life? He says, I see how the people who don't know God look for the meaning of life. I'm doing it better than any of them to try and show them that there isn't one if you don't know God. That's why every so often he says, I think there's nothing better than to eat your bread and drink and live your life and enjoy what you do. Because all of this stuff, those people that are toiling to get the money, toiling because they're greedy, he says they don't have happiness. They don't have that joy. All they have is the money. And you can't take it with you. That's the big thing that everyone says. And it reminds me of a story. There was a story about a man who had millions and millions of dollars. And it was just him and his wife left. He didn't have any kids. And he made it public. He says, I want to be buried with all of my money. And in that public setting, the wife said, okay, if that's what you want, we'll do it. I'll give you all of your money when you die. He says, okay. And he dies. And at the funeral, the wife comes in. Right before they close the casket, the wife comes in with a suitcase. And she tucks it in with him. The attendants come in, they shut it. They cart it away to be buried. And after the funeral, after the burial, one of her friends comes to her and says, I can't believe that you gave him you buried all of that money, never to have it again. And the wife just looked at him and said, "Oh, don't worry. I just wrote him a check." So he still didn't take it with him. We have to remember, money and accomplishments aren't really the meaning of life. Having stuff is not the meaning of life. Oppressing others, power is not the meaning of life. We as Christians have to make it our aim to be Christ-like. That's the meaning of life. Because the closer you are to Him, the closer you are to real life. Because a lot of people are living, but they're not really alive. And as Christians, we see that difference. And we stand up with Job and say, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the end I will see Him. Though this flesh be destroyed, my eyes shall behold Him." My eyes and not another. That's the promise we have and the life we have in Jesus Christ. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for today. Thank you for all the good things you've done, for the blessings you pour out on us. Lord, thank you for your word showing us that it's not about envy. It's not about oppressing others. It's not about power. It's not about greed. It's not about just having money and stuff. It's about living for you. This whole book is all about trying to find a meaning of life without you. And it's proof that there isn't one. Because every situation that we see going on in the world today is mentioned in this book. And it just doesn't fulfill the requirements of a meaning for us being here on this planet. Lord, I pray that you would help us to spread your good news. Lord, to spread your love everywhere we go and in everything we do. Lord, take us safely from here and bring us back safely next week. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.